Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. We are really delighted to host you all for this important discussion on regulating Silicon Valley and Wall Street in today's environment of rapid technological development. I'm Deirdre Mulligan. I'm a professor in the School of Information here at UC Berkeley, and I am also a faculty co-director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. And I co-organize a working group over at the School of Information called the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group, which hosts interdisciplinary conversations. Most recently, I have helped launch the UC Berkeley Executive Fellowship in Applied Technology Policy, an initiative of the School of Information and the Goldman School of Public Policy. Today, under the Executive Fellowship's mission of expanding our university's engagement with tech policy and in collaboration with the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, we are really thrilled to host Rohit Chopra. Rohit Chopra served as director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from 2021 until his removal in February 2025 by Donald Trump. During his tenure, the agency obtained nearly $10 billion, that's with a B, in victim refunds and penalties from firms that violated the law. Prior to his tenure at CFPB, Chopra served as commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission from 2018 to 2021, where he played a major role in reviving the agency's approach to antitrust, to privacy law enforcement, and wrote some spectacularly good dissents. He holds a BA from Harvard and an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, Rohit is here to highlight the importance of regulating big tech and Wall Street, especially amid risks posed by artificial intelligence and personalized pricing. He's going to share how state governments will play a larger role in setting the rules of the road on privacy, antitrust, and consumer protection, areas where the California legislature has already been active and where there are many, many pending proposals. So I'm going to invite Rohit up to talk to us for the next 45 minutes, after which we'll transition into a Q&A. This entire event is going to be recorded, and I hope you will join me in giving Rohit a very warm welcome.
Well, let me thank Professor Mulligan and everyone at the school for having me today. I think it's so important for us to be thinking about the big threats we face as a society, both as Americans, as people who live on this globe, but also for you to think about in California and the role you all can play as a state in charting a path forward. So I actually want to start with talking about two major things that I think shaped the world we live in today, that at least were in my lifetime. For those of you who are in college or grad school or in your 20s, some of this happened when you were quite young. But I thought I'd just share those two events and talk through what it really meant, and then go into how we should think about money and data in the future. The first one is actually something that you probably have all heard of. It is the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, a massive financial crash, a massive destruction of wealth in so many places across the country, and the biggest widening of the racial wealth gap and homeownership that we have seen in decades. It was the result of regulators who were asleep at the switch, who looked the other way as there was set up to fail mortgages and risky practices that pervaded the financial system. The second is something that maybe many of you haven't really thought about, but I consider it to be a very seminal event in global history. And it is a set of events that happened between 2006 and roughly 2009. One of them involved a change to Facebook's interface, specifically the shift from looking at your Facebook profile and seeing your friends' photos, your siblings' cats, and all of a sudden it changed to something called the news feed, away from a chronological look at what your friends and family were sharing, and instead into an algorithmically curated environment. Similarly, we saw the acquisition of YouTube by Google, which transformed a video sharing platform also into an algorithmically curated experience where people were watching videos not that they were browsing for, but that were chosen for them in an almost endless chronology. This was the rise of what is known as behavioral advertising. Unlike old advertising that had billboards or that had advertisements in newspapers or television, something fundamentally changed in the mid-2000s and the years after, where instead of an ad being targeted to a specific segment, such as those who are riding the BART or those who are reading the San Francisco Chronicle, it was an ad targeted to you. It combined information about your search history, your geolocation information, maybe even your biometrics from your wearable device to categorize your state of mind and to know what might be something you will click on. There are many people who have written about the monetization of human behavior, but that ends up being a dramatic change in the way the digital world works. So I'm going to put on pause and talk a little later about the mortgage crisis. I want to start by talking about tech and information and what the internet in America started at and what it has turned into, and how we should think about privacy, antitrust, and AI, and how it affects what we consume in America and how it affects our society. So again, those of you are mostly, this did not occur in your lifespan, but for those of you who are in your 40s or older, may remember something in consumer internet technology. A couple companies, one called Prodigy, one called CompuServe, and another you may have more likely heard of, America Online, or AOL. These were internet services. I don't actually know what we call them now, but they were something you would use dial-up internet. You would actually use your landline and you would dial into a server and you were part of a membership. And on Prodigy and CompuServe, there was games, there was bulletin boards where you could share information about your hobbies or share information about your interests. And this occurred at a time when there was lots of new technology, which seemed quite transformative at the time, of being able to dial in and get data on your personal computer. And all of a sudden, a few years later, there was a major change. It was a set of government standards and private sector standards that would eventually create something called the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web was so different than Prodigy and CompuServe and AOL, mostly because no one really owned it. It was something that just had this openness to it. And really, sometimes the only barrier was you needed to register your domain name. You would sign up for a domain name and you would be able to use a set of tools to publish and use open protocols to exchange information with other people. And the internet obviously really is a US, heavily a US phenomenon at first. It becomes a place where in the US, all sorts of new technologies new publishing online becomes very, very ubiquitous. So I want you to think about our history of information in the internet in some ways as a place where we once had these few gatekeepers, Prodigy, CompuServe, and AOL, and then switched to a totally different world of the World Wide Web. We then have something else that changes the world quite a bit: mobile handsets. All of a sudden, mobile handsets that are internet enabled create a new architecture of how we access the digital world. And instead of websites, we all of a sudden have a different way of navigating called apps. These are places, obviously, that you know very well, but instead of being a completely open protocol, we have to go through app stores, largely controlled by two companies, Google and Apple. And app stores then become a new gatekeeper for setting rules and, in some cases, charging massive tolls to anyone who wants to start an application. And we decide over this time period to really develop a set of laws or to stop enforcing certain laws. One, and I won't go into a lot of detail on this one, but it's a very important one for all of you to think about. It is called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 is a very seminal law in US communications statutes. It ends up being exported all over the world. And it says the following. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. If you are operating a bulletin board or an online service, you're not really liable for any of the mischief or illegal activity that occurs on it. Some of this made a lot of sense. Would you want the telephone company responsible for potentially illegal activity happening on phone calls? Would you want the train operator to potentially be liable for the movement of or illegal activity happening on a train? In some ways, it was trying to make sure that there is open public squares where people can debate. We also see how that law ends up being relied upon for an entirely new purpose. And that brings me to the start of Facebook and other online social media. So I was one of the first users of Facebook in 2003 or 4. It was mostly on college campuses. You actually needed a .edu email at first to get on. You would have a series of friends that you would actually have a connection with. This ends up being replicated across many other types of social media. It has its origins in some other ones, but this is really where it goes big. And over time, it moves into something very, very different. In 2009, I believe it introduces a like button. Just before that, it introduces a share button. And all of a sudden, the visual appearance and the user experience of this is something very, very different on the internet. It is not a fully open protocol. It is still a closed ecosystem in some ways, like an app store. But it is all of a sudden about a market incentive to create as much user behavior and engagement as possible. Because ultimately, that is the way to sell clicks, to sell ads, and to grow what is a private business. So, as Professor Mulligan said, I served on the Federal Trade Commission starting in 2018. And one of the first issues on the docket related to a scandal called Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was a firm that was involved with a personality quiz. This was a personality quiz that I believe was shared all throughout, I want to say 2015 or 2016. It was a very, very widely shared personality quiz where you would share it with your friends. You would then be able to have a set of, you would get a result on what your personality was like. And Cambridge Analytica used Facebook's tools to create an extremely rich data set to categorize people, and I might be getting these words wrong, as paranoid, depressed, excitable. I can't remember the exact descriptors, but what it did was it created a massive database and data set that understood what people's behavioral biases might be, mapping them on what their social network was. And this was essentially a downloadable set of data by this app developer. It later ends up being used as part of 2016 election targeting. I can't recall specifically of its role and use by those who were involved in political campaigns, potentially also in the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, but certainly in the first 2016 election. Facebook's tools, as well as other social networks, then create a way, years prior, to be able to target specific types of ads to individuals, as I mentioned before. And some of you have probably had this experience where you search for something, a particular product online, and then all of a sudden you're almost stalked through the digital world with an ad for that particular product, or you are looking at an online shopping marketplace, and maybe you get toward the end screen, but you don't purchase it, but then you even see more ads targeted to you for it. This is essentially what is being sold by many of our big tech companies when it comes to behavioral advertising. So now it is not just the ability to sell, a doggy raincoat, or, be able to sell a couch or piece of furniture. It starts being used as a way to target individuals in the sense of statecraft, the ability for foreign governments or other entities to be able to engage in information warfare, to shape a public opinion, to shape narratives about what is the world that we are seeing. And the reason why I raise all of this is because we have to think through what is it that these information services are liable for, and how much power should they have in our society. So back to 2018, I arrive at the Federal Trade Commission, and on the docket is the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Facebook had been subject to, years prior, an order by the Federal Trade Commission about violations of privacy, specifically deception about privacy protections on the platform, what they were using the data for. I think actually, if you go even more specific, and Professor Hoopnagel can correct me later, I believe it was specifically around who would have access to your information, and it was always going to be done with your consent. Now, in reality, the investigation revealed that Facebook was violating that order repeatedly and egregiously, sharing information about users for the purpose of advertising monetization to the tune of billions and billions of dollars, and creating a structure where it was almost impossible for there to be competition on privacy. It acquired WhatsApp, it acquired Instagram, it acquired more and more to have a encyclopedia of information about all of us. So the investigation moves on, and here is how it lands. There is unimpeachable evidence about violations of this law enforcement order. And the question becomes, what do we do to fix it? I and others argued that the only way to address this unbelievable thirst for information would be to actually put some meaningful limits on how much companies like Facebook could ingest and monetize from all of us. And specifically, I raised questions about whether the behavioral advertising model was fundamentally broken. And being able to target an individual at that level, is that a normal advertisement at all? And specifically, Section 230 that immunizes a online service like this from any liability about what is happening on their platform, is that appropriate when they are no longer just a passive phone line or a passive train line? Are they actually in on the process of targeting content and pushing it for the purposes of engagement and monetization? And we find these issues on YouTube. YouTube had a serious issue of very, very dark and, in many ways, teenagers in the US being recruited for terrorism, being subjected to extreme content because the algorithm essentially learned that it is more likely to get a click and engagement the darker and more extreme the content is. And I know that I just shared a lot about internet history and Facebook and YouTube, but we need to appreciate that the world is just so different because of these tools. These were dramatic changes to our society, and in many ways have made and can explain the extreme amount of division and the extreme amount of major content that is primarily used to monetize our behavior. So I want to raise this because many of us wonder, what should our information ecosystem look like? Should our information ecosystem, and I'm not someone who's saying we need to go back, to telegrams and go back to where we only have delivered newspapers. I think digital content can be a huge power for democracy. For those of you who have studied the Arab Spring, there are many moments where this can be a huge progress for democracy and commerce. But when can it be used as a weapon, and when can it be used to manipulate? And those are some questions that each of you who study information, who have interests in policy, how do we create an information ecosystem online that is about the core principles of having a marketplace of ideas and information, and not needing to beg or adapt to the financial incentives of 2 or 3 companies in the world? And I think those are the stakes of what we face. We will go into more discussion on this, but I want to specifically talk about what we face when it comes to the huge aggregations of data about us, especially when it comes to these tech platforms. One of the things that is a major moment for everybody to watch is how there is a debate right now on, should big tech companies be able to issue their own currency. So in 2019, Facebook announces that they want to create a new currency called Libra. Libra is going to be a proprietary tech currency. It is going to be used throughout Facebook's properties, and it was enlisting merchants and apps across the economy to plug into it. And I had a lot of concerns at the time about what this currency was going to be used for. There were central banks that were worried it could cause like financial instability. There was all sorts of worries. But to me, one of the things we have to be careful of is when there is so much information about our individual transactions, will we lurch into a world of personalized pricing? So personalized pricing is the idea that there are no more price tags anymore. There is a price for a good or service that is completely driven based on information the merchant has about you. And over the years, there has been studies, and I haven't validated all of these, but one common one you may have heard about is the stories of two different people um, calling for a ride share late at night. And the male user gets a materially lower price than the female user. Now, people postulated that the algorithm is able to think about, would there be a difference in terms of safety walking for two different people? And should that be determining the price? Some of you may know that if you all go to the same exact listing on certain websites, for those of you with Android devices, you will probably see a lower price than those who have iOS or Apple devices. And we are accustomed to personalized prices in some arenas. When we go to an auto dealer to buy a car, we end up negotiating often a price. There isn't really a price tag. But for most things that we buy, we are accustomed to getting a clear price. But once a technological service has a window into every single thing that we are buying and how much we are paying for it, and they already are starting to gather this information when we tap our phones using online payment services, they are getting senses of information about how much are we willing to pay for certain products based on certain state of mind that we have. So a very simple example could be that once they know that you have to fly to a funeral for a grandparent, would they be able to sell that information in conjunction with an airline or a hotel to charge you much more? If they know that your child is on a video game platform and constantly seeking a particular type of toy or product, will they be able to use that to charge you more when there is a shortage of that? Will they be able to discriminate based on the fact that you might be a particular race or gender? Would they be able to use that in an exploitative way? So I think that as we look to the future, we have to make sure that technology is constantly making life better. But we have in our recent history allowed technology to transform life in ways that didn't have a lot of public debate. And in the discussion with Professor Mulligan, we'll talk about some of the things maybe we can do to fix some of this, but also to what we have to chart going forward. Now, let me switch back to the mortgage crisis. So in this area, if you look at some of the zip codes that are not far from Berkeley, but all through the Bay Area, it was not as severe as in Southern California, but California was terribly hit by the subprime mortgage crisis. There was a few types of firms that had really reshaped how mortgage lending was given and it was that being executed in America. So really from like the time of like the Code of Hammurabi, lending was always done. You would issue a loan to someone because you'd make money when they paid you back. But something had changed with a whole set of lenders in America. They were going to be able to issue you a mortgage and quickly sell it to somebody else. And even if they knew that you would not be able to pay it back, they would make a profit. This disrupted almost like thousands of years of lending history, where normally you would make money by someone paying back. In this case, they didn't have to pay it back. Over time, we see a massive run-up in amount of dangerous mortgages. And again, the result is actually an enormous loss of homes. And to make things worse, there was systemic illegal foreclosures where homeowners would get lawsuits saying that they hadn't paid, and an entity suing them didn't even have proof that they owned the mortgage. And it was totally chaotic, and it was a total mess, both for families, but also for the global economy. And for those of you who remember, but most of you may not, the actual policy response to this was very, very big bailouts. There was a large amount of money that was put in to capitalize. When I say capitalize, meaning rescue the banks, to ensure that the economy could stabilize, and the hope that existed for homeowners was actually pretty modest. The results of also systemic wrongdoing and systemic fraud did not lead to the closure of certain businesses. It actually meant that some of these large financial institutions actually got bigger and more powerful. And I think that the mortgage crisis proves to be not only an important moment in the history of Wall Street, it ends up being a really important moment also for the public. It spawns a few different, I think, movements. One is Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street, in many ways, is a searing critique of the existing way that high finance dictates the rules of the economy. It is largely coming from the left. And there's also another movement known as the Tea Party that starts around 2009, 2010, maybe 2010, with a searing critique about the system, largely from the right, about bailouts, and about personal responsibility for individuals and for companies. And I actually think when you look at what has happened to the neighborhoods that were most impacted by foreclosures, we also see that they were impacted heavily by the opioid crisis, by other serious breakdowns in employment and opportunity. And I think that that has set the stage for a lot of anger and resentment about a broken system. And honestly, I can't really disagree with people on it. So we need to be thinking pretty hard about the role of big concentrated power in our country. I think that there is a role to make sure that there is not too much dominance of power in the hands of the few, and especially a few companies, and using new tools like antitrust and certain ways to regulate can rein in that abuse of power. So where are we right now? I led an agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I took office in 2021. And during that time, we brought and really tried to target the biggest actors who were engaged in nationwide fraud. I'll give a couple of examples. We sued and we're litigating, meaning in the courtroom, a company called Capital One. Capital One, we alleged, had illegally withheld billions of dollars in interest on people's savings accounts. The way in which this took place was a way in which they deceived consumers about whether they were in the high rate account or not. We also sued one of the nation's largest mortgage companies called Rocket for an illegal kickback scheme to steer mortgages to Rocket Mortgage. We sued a company known as TransUnion, as well as a top former executive, for deceiving people about certain types of service credit monitoring services that harmed so many people. And in many cases, we were able to get very favorable outcomes. You don't win them all, but we were able to get billions of dollars back for people. In many cases, we were saving homes. We were blocking illegal auto repossessions and so much more. But what has occurred in the past few weeks is that there has been a series of pardons, essentially. The cases are being completely wiped out, dismissed from courtrooms. And there is not necessarily an announcement of why it is being removed. It is happening with no real understanding of what the issue of why they would remove it. And in fact, many of the cases that are being pulled from courtrooms were not ones that I authorized, but that even my predecessor under the first Trump administration authorized. So we're in a moment right now where is there going to be meaningful law enforcement over very big actors? And that to me is a jump ball right now. At the same time, there is some ongoing work that is happening now at the state level. And I'm going to close with this because I wanted to share, where do we sort of go from here if many of these agencies are being deleted? So I think that you as Californians need to think about what is the role of your state in combating abuses when it comes to our information and data, but also when it comes to our pocketbooks and money. So there's a few things. I think Professor Mulligan already raised the issue of state laws. There is a lot that states at the state level can pass to make sure that consumers are being protected and to make sure that our personal data is not being weaponized. California already has one type of privacy law as well as other consumer protections, but it is incumbent upon us right now to see what we can do to put more into place. But there is also more that state law enforcement can do. Each of you who study information or consumers always must know about an entity that is in every state in America called state attorneys general. State attorneys general have the power to, in many ways, bring cases for violations of federal law, even in the states. And we really need those state attorneys general, and I've been spending a lot of time with all of them, how they will fill in the gaps right now for law enforcement that is being, at the federal level, being defunded and defanged. So as you think about the future of the information ecosystem, I want you to think about what is the values we should bring. We probably want it to be ones that is like the World Wide Web, where no one owns it, no one needs to punch the ticket, but that it is open for all of us to share the information in a fair way. And we also want a financial system that is not about abuse of power, but about pooling our money in banks so that it can be lent to people to start their pizzeria, their dry cleaner, or their awesome new startup, to finance more broadband infrastructure, to finance ports and roads. We should not have a financial system that is there to pick people's pockets or cheat them out of their life savings. So I think that I am running out of time, but I hope that each of you in this moment do not think you have no power. You have a lot to steer the future as to what kind of world we want to have, especially when we go online and when we tap our phones and borrow for all the milestones of the American dream. So thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. That gave us so much to think about. And luckily, we have an audience that is full of people who have been thinking about how to shape markets, tethering, competition, privacy, Section 230. So I think we're poised to have a really good conversation. So I wanted to start off. I keep wanting to call you Director Chopra, which is just, can't do that. Rohit, Mr. Chopra.
Rohit's good. Rohit's good.
Can't really do that. I wanted to start off, Rohit, by asking you to talk a little bit about what you think we ought to have done. Right? You've lodged some criticisms. I mentioned and have made some of my students read some of your dissents in, for example, the FTC action against Facebook. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the kinds of structural reforms that you think regulators should have demanded. Like, what was the vision that you wanted to put forward?
Yeah, I think at my core, can you still hear me? I think we have to, number one, always be careful about privatizing the internet. So once you create sort of real estate in the internet that people can own, I think that becomes a bit of a problem. So we always want to create technological standards and structures that really minimize the entry points for getting in. And I would also say that we have to be very, very realistic about, is behavioral advertising just destined to create a lot of harm? I personally would favor that Section 230 immunity should be more limited to passive pipes. When I say passive pipes, if you are someone who is not monetizing certain types of content, you should not really be liable for certain types of harm that occurs. But as soon as you are algorithmically curating content, I think that you're much more like a newspaper than you are, just like a phone company. So I do think we should rethink the immunities under Section 230. I also think we should be very, very wary of mega mergers by very large banks and very large tech companies. When Microsoft in the 1990s, and 2000s, Microsoft really had a lot of control over desktop computing. Windows was like the gatekeeper for everything. And only because, in my view, that the US and Europe stood up to Microsoft. Without those actions, I don't think we would have a Facebook, Google, Amazon, and the list goes on. So we need to be looking very hard about mergers as well. I think that the documents suggested to me that Facebook acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram, Google's acquisition of YouTube, I'm not sure we were better off because of it. In fact, I think much of it is about eliminating competition, eliminating the next big player and just killing it. And maybe they are integrating it and they would argue, well, we're making it better by investing in it. But I think that that is more dominance by a couple players in it. I think we should be extremely wary when it comes to artificial intelligence about allowing long-standing laws to be totally ignored. For example, when you if you're rejected for a loan, federal law clearly says you need to be given a statement of reasons as to why. If you are rejected for renting an apartment and the landlord uses a credit report, you're entitled to look at that credit report and get some transparency. I think we need to make sure that the existing laws we have on the books are actually being followed. I think we should be putting, and sorry for the long answer, we should be putting much tougher, we should be much more wary about identity theft and fraud. Right now, the technology essentially allows someone's voice and appearance to be cloned. And that is often a recipe for when it's misused to defraud people. I think that we are using more automated tools and masquerading them as human. So, for example, when I was director, the CFPB did a study of chatbots that are used by banks, and many of them were given traditionally female names, like Bank of America called theirs Erica. And what was very illuminating to me is those chatbots, when you were talking to them, they would sometimes show an ellipsis, the dot, 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 that you and I know is a sign that someone is typing and composing. The chatbot is not making typos. The chatbot is not thinking, is this the right wording? There is a lot that is occurring to make automated tools, bot accounts, and others seem like a human interaction. And we need to draw a much tougher, brighter line between human and non-human interaction. And I can go on, but I think at the end of the day, we should be setting the rules of the road to create technological innovation that is not going to be weaponized against the society. And I'm not sure the interventions are so hard, but of course, from certain kind of deep-pocketed interests, they will have a lot of pushback.
Wow, that was a very rich answer. I'm going to pull on maybe three different threads just to tease out. So, you've talked about the vision of the World Wide Web, the creation at the World Wide Web Consortium up at MIT and CERN in France. And we got this set of technical standards that layer on top of the technical standards that are set by the Internet Engineering Task Force and allow for, as you said, kind of this proliferation of speakers, diversity of views, very easy for anybody to create a website and become not just a consumer of information, but to have a voice, right? And this was an incredible thing if we think about our commitment to the First Amendment, right? The idea that everybody was going to be able to have their own little mini newspaper, right? Their ability to publish and speak. And the importance of the open, interoperable technical standards that help move that vision forward. So I think about where we are with artificial intelligence today, and we have platforms and models and data that are being like increasingly sold as like a complete stack, right? Like,
Yes.
so how are you even thinking about where are those logical layers of separation? Where should we be pushing for open interfaces or interoperability that would help us avoid what I'm going to kind of say, I think, is like the walled gardens that you're concerned about with the Meta, Facebook, Google, other platforms that you've talked about today? How do we don't even have the technical infrastructure right now as a substrate for regulators to pull on? And I'm wondering how you're thinking about that.
So I really encourage everyone to think about this type of problem in a in a totally different non-technical field, because it helps you guide your own values and instincts on how you would approach it. So an area that I think a lot about is banking. So banking, again, is this really interesting concept where all of us can put our money in deposits in a bank. And interestingly, we have a system of laws and regulations that always allows you to get it back, because we have deposit insurance, we have the Federal Reserve lending. But there's a certain magic of this was when we pool all of our deposits in the banking system, we allow banks to create money in some ways by lending to all sorts of people on their ideas. And the net result is all of us together create this asset that has a lot of value. And when I think about artificial intelligence, LLMs, other types of advanced computational methods, it has a similar feeling to me, which is that it's pooling all of our knowledge and insights and information and creating something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And then the question becomes, is who owns that and who should be able to monetize that? My view is the banks, we let them monetize it. We say that we're going to compensate the banks by taking risks, by figuring out the best loans to issue, and they can make a little bit of a profit off of it. And when it comes to things like these foundational models, I'm not sure that only the model developer should get the bulk of the monetization. In fact, we probably want little companies to be able to access this, which, by the way, they are able to do that today. But we have some lessons from the past where open systems, in fact, the Android operating system used to largely be an open system, but over time became more and more closed as Google sought to monetize it. So we should think of what are the ways in which these models are not just something that the model owner can monetize, but that really lots of different developers have access to. I could go on, but I think we should always look at the US economy. We did way better than Europe and the rest of the world, not because we had a few dominant national champion companies. It's because that we wanted lots and lots of little firms, especially when it came to advanced technology, biosciences, telecommunications. And that should really be a focus for us of making sure that AI does not get monopolized.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific way to kind of think about both fiduciary relationships, sharing a profit, right? There's a whole bunch of things that I think um, you're conjuring up for me and thinking about it through this other metaphor, through this other example. Love that.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we don't lose as we advance in technology. And by the way, I don't actually think AI is more transformative to society than electrification. I think or mass automation of manufacturing. I think we've always had these like really, really big moments. And I think the way that we should always navigate them is how do we preserve like individuality of humans and citizens? And how do we keep letting others participate? Because I think that drives the society forward.
Great. So I'm going to pull on the individuality. You said a bunch of things about the ways in which advances today in LLMs, in particular chatbots, but also the possibility of perhaps you were talking about things that could assume our likeness. One could imagine that being different kinds of more embodied
Yeah.
robots and things like that in the future. And this sense that we owe it to ourselves collectively to be able to police the line between when you're interacting with a human and when you're interacting with something that is non-human. And we've it's been a lot of language use that I think is really interesting. People talk about this is a relationship bot
Mm.
or this bot is a friend. And I'm kind of like, why are we using those terms, right? What is a relationship? What makes something a relationship? What makes someone a friend, right? It's certainly not the sycophantic behavior we might see of some of the existing chatbots. Those are not good friends. Those are people who clearly want something from you, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what are the particular aspects of that you would like to police? Like, where are that you think are particularly important in the commercial marketplace? What are you concerned about? We know, like, exploiting particular cognitive
Yeah.
biases that we have been really important in policing and consumer protection and finance for unfairness and deception. So just wondering, like, what in particular do you think it should be not okay? Like, where are the
Yeah.
lines?
So I would only have my own individual view. I do think that that is something we have as a society to answer and shouldn't just be answered by like six tech bros. Like we should be answering that as a people of where that line would be. So I come down with a couple of simple things. I'm a big believer in labeling. So I'm not really sure. I have become, I always hear the pushback to it. I'm not sure I'm really seeing all the benefits of fake and impersonator accounts. So right now, there is basically no oversight when it comes to me setting up an account where I call myself Deirdre Mulligan and put a photo on that account and then use it to communicate. So maybe there is some restrictions in the terms and conditions somewhere, but there's no real meaningful enforcement of that. Now that's me really using your likeness and others, but there's also the fact that you can commercially set up accounts, sometimes thousands of accounts, to be able to simulate a crowd of opposition or a crowd of support. I'm just really not seeing the upside of this. So we would just not, we really wouldn't allow you to set up 1,000 dummy accounts in banking because we would say there'd be money laundering, there would be fraud, there would be all sorts of things. And there's a lot of these types of assumptions that are just part of the internet that I want us to question more. And the retention of individual um, identity is very, very important to me as just one of them. I would also say that the ability for us to use information and technology to distort or shape a child or adolescent mind is a very, very serious one. I think we have all fundamentally agreed that in our society, we recognize that children and adolescents on a biological basis go through cognitive development in ways that are just different than other adults. The ability to discern reality from fiction. And I think we're all comfortable saying, yeah, like it's a different thing to allow a 25-year-old to smoke a cigarette as opposed to a 5-year-old. And I think the way in which we have, without much discussion, allowed the infiltration of the digital world in kids and teens is something that I think just feels very dangerous and outdated. We now know that suicide and other harms to teenagers is often coming from how they are accessing and consuming content. We know that it is changing fundamentally the sociology of high schools. We know that kids are being targeted on gaming platforms by those who are engaged in illegal predation of children. So I do think that thinking about specific populations is something that should also be part of the framework. I for example, favor laws that much more strictly criminalize the sharing of military service members' data. Some of you might remember a wearable device was reporting the jogging patterns of service members in undertaking, I don't want to say covert operations, but something secret. Better handling of those types of individuals' information, I would also favor. So thinking about it, that's a long way of saying retaining individuality, but thinking about portions of the population that can really be targeted is important to me.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one more question and then we're going to open it up. So please get ready with your questions. Everyone wants to reform Section 230, so not too surprised that you too have your own ideas about Section 230. So I'm an OG Section 230
You are.
person, right? And can tell you like Section 230 wasn't created to protect
Correct.
entities being neutral pipes. It was created to actually encourage them to engage in moderation of all sorts.
It was, yes.
And so I'm wondering, when for you, and I think we also all agree that if platforms didn't do much of the moderation that they currently do, parts of the internet would be more of a cesspool, and there's that too. And so I'm wondering when you talk about algorithmic curation and that being a distinct thing, in what context is it distinct? And setting aside whether or not you'd win under the current law, just wondering, like, what do you think requires? Because it used to be people would hand curate lists. It's not like they weren't curating
Totally.
things or even curating them for individual communities. But yeah, so
I think it's not. I don't want to be picky about it, but I don't think the incentives for moderation also were assumptions about how they monetized. So I think that in a world, we are always going to have quote unquote cesspools. There's always going to be discussion, information that maybe we don't agree with. I don't think we should focus on making sure that there's not, things we don't like to hear, but I do worry about the financial incentives to elevate certain content over others, not for the purposes of making a website feel cleaner, but for the purposes of actual user behavior monetization to get someone to click on a particular ad. And I really fear that Section 230 has been totally overused in protecting that type of. When I was at the CFPB, we have filed an amicus in a lot of litigation. Section 230 has been used to try and immunize from the Fair Credit Reporting Act, from all sorts of consumer protection laws. And I'm not a communications law expert, but I think where I am is that the world in which it was designed for is something totally different. And the things that we were trying to protect back then, maybe we can still protect that, but come up and actually debate what we should have for the future. So I'm not someone who thinks it should be totally killed, but sometimes I think we become so passive when it comes to technology rather than how we thought about the internet, where we were, as a public, actively shaping it, as you mentioned, we did in the World Wide Web.
yeah. So the thing that I think I'm just going to draw out of that is that your emphasis actually wasn't on the creation or the development of the content, but it was about the extent to which that was a revenue model.
Exactly.
And
The
therefore
monetization.
the monetization of the targeting, which is just interesting. All right, we're going to open it up. Please raise your hands. We have 2 mics, I believe. Please. And introduce yourself, please. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Dan. Okay. Both. Yeah.
Hi, I'm John Kunze. I have, in my lifetime, I've been very curious to see why, if you have any ideas on why there seems to be such shyness about prosecution. We've talked about the big banks failing, and I expected people to go to jail. I expected mergers to be stopped. I'm just sort of, it just seems like there's a hope, someone had just told Donald Trump no once, but it feels like, oh, do you have an explanation for that or any thoughts about why don't we prosecute more?
I've spent like 25 years wondering that myself. I mean, I do think there is something to be said about what are the incentives we give to prosecutors. I think it is true that prosecutors often want to target small firms and know that they'll win, or to do a cheap settlement with a big firm and being able to declare victory. Um, many and most of those settlements do often not really redress the harm. And for small companies facing an investigation, it can be a do or die moment. And a large one seems to think of it as a cost of doing business. And it is really a fundamental, I think, impediment to fair capitalism. You cannot have two sets of rules, one for new companies and small companies, and another one for big ones. I think there are lots of explanations for this. I don't necessarily have a solution, but I would hope that the public, when they see a sort of defunding the police for Wall Street and Silicon Valley, that they realize that that is not what is in our national interest. What is in our national interest is that laws are really something that everyone must follow. We say equal justice under the law. We do not have that right now. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
Thank you.
My question is informed by my understanding that the EU's GDPR has changed the online experience for people around the world, regardless of their citizenship or location, due to the market power of the EU and the inability or unwillingness of tech companies to create a fully customized online experience depending on your citizenship or location. And I was wondering, speaking as you were about California's unique role, I was wondering what types of opportunities you think are most available to us as California constituents and voters to use our market power to improve the online experiences of folks around the world.
You know, I'm a big believer. I do believe in sovereignty. I believe that people, through their democratic process, should be able to self-govern. So I don't know if I want to recommend that kind of California push to export what it wants to do to the whole world. You're right that there are many places where big jurisdictions that are huge economic players, they end up having a ripple effect. But I think California should also protect Californians and in many ways use the values that you all have to safeguard your markets and still continue to be a very major hotbed of transformational technology. So a few places that I would start are, where are there places where, just like I was saying before, we can think about kids and teens more? Where is it that we can think about the targeting of military members? Where is it that we can maintain open access? I think that there is just such an important place for states to do this. And I think we are learning through these tariff wars and others that I didn't know that Canadian premiers had all this power. I mean, now that they are looking to flex it, we see that small and mid-sized nations all over are charting new paths on their laws. So the advice is, don't wait for someone else to do it. I think go and experiment and pass laws. But you're right that it probably will have a ripple effect on others.
I hope you guys are keeping track. I think down center here was the next question. And then I think over here.
My name's Marcel, and I want to introduce an aspect which wasn't touched really base on. If we mentioned Arab Spring, the impact of social media and that revolution, that's potentially also, I mean, if you've been long around in Silicon Valley, you might remember that our tech pros were all in a sudden questioning the US government and its role, necessity of statehood in itself. But these are all also vulnerabilities for the United States, in particular in that context, if we think about TikTok, that all in a sudden we are not, or we can be guided by other behavioral algorithms from the outside. And so then my question would be, how much of antitrust consumer protection agency can protect against foreign adversaries?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that is true that state and non-state actors are developing a huge dimension of modern warfare through the information ecosystem. I do think that we should be mindful about China developing dossiers maybe on all of us. And by the way, I would say that it used to really be through hacks. The interesting thing about the Marriott data breach, Equifax data breach, Anthem data breach, I think, OPM, lots of it was not related to people trying to rip people off, but to assemble information for statecraft purposes. So, I don't have a great answer for you other than making sure we can appreciate that it has a weapon-like function. Certainly when it comes to the ownership of TikTok, certainly TikTok today can go have an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange and be spun off as an independent company here in the US. I certainly would want to make sure that we are constantly thinking about how state actors can engage in surveillance over us. And I think when it comes to protecting privacy, the links between privacy and national security are increasing.
Hello, my name's Anagha. So, you spoke about the importance of reining in big companies like, Meta, Google, and all of those. But I was wondering, as these private businesses grow, doesn't that contribute to government revenue in some way? And does that mean that legal institutions are kind of forced to prioritize business growth, because there are some built-in incentives for them?
I want to make sure I'm following the question. So you're saying because companies get large, they contribute to tax revenue? Well, I mean, I actually am not sure that's 100% automatically true. I mean, if we just had Microsoft versus lots and lots of other companies spawned by it, the amount of economic activity could actually be larger. And I think there's some arguments that because of Amazon's enormous market power, it has reduced the number of online marketplaces that sellers feel obligated to sell there. So I'm not totally sure. I think it's really an issue of political power, which is when those firms have so much political power, do they then start writing the rules? I might also say that, our big tech companies here, for those of you who are following tariffs and trade right now, a very large explanation for some of our services exports, Ireland, other places, this is largely tax avoidance by some of our big tech companies and big pharmaceutical companies. So again, it's also possible that large firms are more likely to engage in sophisticated tax avoidance. So I just don't know which way it cuts.
All right, I'm going to ask actually that we bring the mics down here. There were a set of hands up. Put your hands back up. And why don't we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions? And yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but why don't we take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll take 2 or 3 from over here. Yeah.
Okay. I am Pamela. So when you're talking about big tech regulation, one of the arguments that come from the proponents of current practices are, oh, it's going to stifle innovation. And directly to your point about big tech buyouts, so most startups, their goal is to either IPO or have a bigger company buy them out. So if you're talking about regulating how companies are being acquired or how startups are being acquired, what other conversations do you think should be had or are being had around making up for the effects that this or these regulations are going to have on innovation?
Yeah, I don't buy into this trade-off. When we actually look at the US and its history, often the reason why we had better capital markets, the reason why we've had a lot of things that were more advanced was actually because we as a society did create some rules, not because we didn't. I think there can be a little bit of a blind spot that people think that we live in this completely free market. We literally have a government agency that every month sets the price and supply of money. I'm serious. I mean, this is what the Fed does. We do not have just this completely, no rules world. So I think what I would like to see is we should nurture the innovation in many, many ways. Obviously, I'd like to see simple rules. I'd also like to see public investment. And I'd like to see lots of, especially in science and technology, but also a real strong commitment to fair competition. You raise a really interesting point. Many companies want to exit and get their payoff by selling to a bigger company. One of the problems is that investors, venture capital, others, some of them would even tell me, I only want to invest in companies that can sell to these 3 or 4 places. That is actually not going to create always massively disruptive innovation. That probably will create a situation where they feel threatened and therefore want to buy and kind of take out the competition. So we need to weigh this on both sides. I ultimately would like to see more companies be able to fund, scale, and unseat the big guys, and maybe a new big guy can come.
Hi, my name is Yun Kai. I'm an international student from China, and I aim to become a software engineer. But my question is not about the big techs. It's basically about my personal experience as a tenant here in the US. In my apartment, the property company did provide me a heating system as required. However, the system was extremely energy inefficient. It burned through about $500 a month during the winter here in the Mediterranean climate. So when I raised this, the property company insisted that they fulfilled their obligation by providing a heating system. But the energy cost did happen. So as a consumer protection expert, how do you see the situation like this, where a service is technically delivered, but in a way that may create disproportionate harm or financial burden for the user like me? Do you think that existing consumer protection frameworks are sufficient for cases like this, or is there an area where we need clearer rules? Thank you.
This question speaks to my heart. The number of Americans who are energy cost burdened is extraordinary. In some states, more than 25% of utility customers are behind. And there is a systemic issue of rental units having extremely inefficient appliances. The appliances lead to even more rent burden for them. And it also becomes really difficult to compare different apartments based on the likelihood of what the total cost would be for ordinary use consumption. So for those of you who have purchased like a washing machine or a television in the United States, there's a yellow sticker that goes on it that is supposed to disclose what normal usage would cost. There's some evidence to suggest that it has prompted people to understand what the full cost of the appliance might be. Of course, the renter is not in a place where they would know some of that. So I do think there are laws that could be used to better protect tenants and better disclose what that would be. State and local ordinances can also play a big role, but I just am so glad you're raising something that is literally a pain point for a huge part of the population that gets no airtime at all. I mean, we do not talk enough about the amount of debt that people are incurring from utilities these days. And by the way, these are not people that are like using their dishwasher 3 times a day. Ordinary use of some of this is really a huge financial drag on so many people, and it is leading to a lot of debt. And I just really, there are laws on the books we can use. That's the answer. And we should pay more attention to it.
All right, we got our last question.
First of all, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. My question is about the FTC's role in the cybersecurity field. As you know, there is no one specialized unit in the United States in field of cybersecurity. But your point is interesting for me. Do you think that the modern threats, the FTC is able to like come up with the modern threats, or what tools do the FTC use in field of preparing all the standards and rules for the companies or states as an advising agency as well? For example, AI or post-quantum cryptography.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's a great question. I think of data security, cybersecurity in the broader framework of data protection. In the US, we have a very sector-based approach for it. So, for example, in financial services, there's specific law and rules about the protection of financial information. We have in our US law called HIPAA, a certain data protection, data security element of it. Children's online privacy may also have a separate data security element. In the energy grid, we also have it. So look, the cases that often the FTC and state AGs bring, this is not exactly the legal theory, but it's a little bit like a negligence type standard, which is like your username and password were username and password, like, or admin, whatever it might be. I think that we probably always should have clearer rules. We have an agency. What does CISA stand for? Cyber Security and Information. Cyber and Information Security Agency. I think overall, the developed countries have invested a lot in this, but I don't have an answer on whether they're capable or not. I think we also need, to make sure we have strong laws as well.
I think the one thing I would say, and I'd ask you to articulate this a little bit more. One of the most interesting things about the CFPB is it is the only enforcement agency and oversight agency that has really been created in modern times. And if you look at the composition of the CFPB, the other one you can look at is here in California, the California Consumer Privacy Agency. And they have very different staffing. there are much more technical people at the CFPB than there were at the FTC, and particularly proportionally, I think. And so one of the questions I think we have today when we think about the future of tech policy or the future of public policy generally, understanding the role of technical expertise, data scientists, computer scientists, cybersecurity people, in not just designing systems and supporting implementation, but actually helping in enforcement actions, helping in investigations, and helping develop policy. And I think you've had a lot of experiences across those two agencies that speak to this particular question at a meta level.
And recruiting really great technical talent. Lawyers don't have a monopoly on law enforcement. And we need all of those people. And that's what we did at the CNPB. Now, they've been benched or laid off. But bringing them in, as well as bringing people in with all sorts of, even psychologists who know about digital design and the impact on human behavior. We need a lot of you to be part of law enforcement and regulation for this to all work out in our country.
Yeah. So, all right. If you can all join me in thanking Rohit Chopra for his talk.